spotted an alligator with an object in his mouth. As the detective got closer, they fired one round to the alligator. The alligator dropped the object that he had in his mouth.
What in the world would make a father throw his toddler into a lake only to be found in the mouth of an alligator? How do you even tell someone that he also stabbed the baby's mother 100 times? Not one, not two, not 10, I mean 100 times. The murky waters of Lake Maggiore rippled under the Florida sun as police officers approached the shoreline. What began as a desperate search for a missing toddler was about to become a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. "We've got something," called out one officer, his voice tight with tension as he pointed toward movement in the water. The officers froze, their breath catching as they spotted it. An alligator swimming near the lake's edge, carrying something in its powerful jaws. As the creature moved closer, the horrifying reality became clear. Clutched between those deadly teeth was the tiny body of 2-year-old Taylen Mosley. Nothing prepares you for seeing a child like that. Nothing. The discovery sent shockwaves through St. Petersburg, Florida, a community already reeling from the news that Taylen's mother, 20-year-old Pashun Jeffery, had been found brutally murdered in her apartment just hours earlier. Her body bore the evidence of a frenzied attack, over 100 stab wounds covering her torso, neck, and face. The apartment walls were splattered with blood, telling the story of a woman who had fought desperately for her life. But where was Taylen? That question had driven the massive search operation that led officers to Lake Maggiore, roughly 10 minutes from Pashun's apartment. Now, as they watched the alligator swimming with the toddler's body, the full horror of what had happened began to take shape. Wildlife officials were called to the scene and the difficult task of retrieving Taylen's remains began. The alligator was eventually euthanized and the little boy's body was recovered. The medical examiner would later determine that Taylen had died from drowning, suggesting he had been placed in the water while still alive. "Who could do this?" whispered one officer at the scene, a question that would echo throughout the investigation that followed. The answer, according to police, was Thomas Mosley, Taylen's 21-year-old father and Pashun's on-again, off-again boyfriend. Just hours after the birthday party Pashun had thrown for him, police believe Thomas unleashed a savage attack on the mother of his child before taking their son to the lake and leaving him to a fate too terrible to contemplate. By the time Taylen's body was discovered, Thomas Mosley had already checked himself into a local hospital. His hands and arms were severely cut, injuries consistent with what happens when a knife slips during a frenzied stabbing attack. He offered no explanation for his wounds, but blood evidence at the apartment would soon tell the story he refused to share. "The level of violence in this case is almost beyond comprehension," police chief told the press. "We're talking about a mother stabbed over 100 times and a toddler who was taken to a lake and left for the alligators. This isn't just murder. This is evil in its purest form. What drives a man to murder the mother of his child in such a brutal fashion? What darkness consumes someone so completely that they could take their own toddler, a child who trusted them completely, and feed them to an alligator? These are the questions that haunt this case, questions that may never have satisfying answers. As we explore this devastating story, we'll look at the relationship between Thomas and Pashun, the events leading up to that fatal birthday party, and the aftermath of a crime that left a community in shock. We'll examine how domestic violence often hides in plain sight until it explodes into tragedy, and how the legal system sometimes fails those most vulnerable. Before we continue, I want to ask you, have you ever witnessed the warning signs of domestic violence in someone you know? Have you ever wondered what happens in the mind of someone who can commit such horrific acts against their own family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might help someone else recognize danger before it's too late. Now, let's go back to the beginning to understand how a birthday celebration became the catalyst for one of Florida's most disturbing murder cases in recent memory. The morning of March 30th, 2023 began with an unanswered phone call. Pashun's supervisor at work tried reaching her multiple times after she failed to show up for her shift, something completely out of character for the reliable young mother. By early afternoon, concern had transformed into alarm, and Pashun's mother made the fateful decision to check on her daughter and grandson. What she discovered inside apartment 1701 at the Lincoln Shores Apartments would forever haunt her. The door was unlocked, another red flag for a mother who was meticulous about her son's safety. As she stepped inside, the overwhelming metallic smell of blood hit her first. Then came the horrifying sight: her daughter's body, lying in a massive pool of blood in the bathroom. The 911 call came in at approximately 2:52 p.m., explained by one of the first responders on the scene. The caller was hysterical, screaming that her daughter was dead and covered in blood. She kept asking where her grandson was. Police arrived within minutes to find a scene of extreme violence. Blood spatter covered the walls, ceiling, and floor of the bathroom. Bloody footprints tracked through the apartment, telling the story of the killer's movements after the attack. Pashun's body showed evidence of a frenzied assault. The medical examiner later confirmed she had been stabbed more than 100 times. The attack was sustained and brutal, noted by the medical examiner. The number and depth of wounds indicate extreme rage. The victim had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, showing she fought desperately to survive. But the most alarming discovery was what police didn't find. Little Taylen was nowhere in the apartment. His crib was empty, his diaper bag missing. A massive search operation was immediately launched, with officers going door to door throughout the complex, checking dumpsters, nearby woods and waterways. Time is critical in missing child cases, explained an officer who coordinated the search. We had every available officer and K-9 unit searching. We brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. The entire community mobilized to find this child. As the search for Taylen intensified, investigators began piecing together the events leading up to Pashun's murder. They learned about the birthday party held the previous evening and began tracking Thomas Mosley's movements afterward. What they discovered was chilling. Security cameras from a nearby gas station captured Thomas at around 8:30 a.m. on March 30th, hours after the murder likely occurred. He appeared calm as he purchased a drink and snacks, giving no indication of the horror he had left behind in apartment 1701. By mid-morning, Thomas had checked himself into St. Anthony's Hospital with severe lacerations on both hands and arms, injuries consistent with what happens when a knife slips during a stabbing attack and cuts the attacker's hands. He offered no explanation for his injuries, simply stating he needed medical attention. Those kinds of wounds are what we call transfer injuries, forensic analyst explains. When someone stabs with such force and frequency, the knife becomes slippery with blood. The hand slides down onto the blade, causing deep cuts to the attacker. It's actually quite common in frenzied knife attacks. Hospital staff, unaware of the murder, treated Thomas's injuries. It wasn't until police began investigating Pashun's death that they connected Thomas to the hospital visit. By then, he was under medical care and under police observation. Meanwhile, the search for Taylen continued with growing urgency. The first day passed with no sign of the toddler. Then came a breakthrough that led to the heartbreaking discovery at Lake Maggiore. We received information that Thomas had been seen near the lake the morning after the murder, a detective explained. A witness reported seeing a man matching his description, carrying what looked like a bundle toward the water around 5:30 a.m. This tip redirected the search to Lake Maggiore, approximately 10 minutes from the apartment complex. Police and wildlife officials began combing the shoreline and waters. It was during this search that officers spotted the alligator with Taylen's body. The recovery operation was complex and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Wildlife officials had to euthanize the alligator to retrieve Taylen's remains. The medical examiner later determined that the cause of death was drowning, indicating that Thomas had placed his son in the water while the child was still alive. The evidence suggests the child was alive when he entered the water. There were no other significant injuries prior to drowning. This means the child was conscious and aware when he was put into that lake. This revelation added another layer of horror to an already unimaginable crime. Not only had Thomas allegedly stabbed Pashun over 100 times in a brutal attack, but he had also taken his conscious, living son to a lake known to contain alligators and left him there to die. Back at the crime scene, forensic teams were uncovering damning evidence against Thomas. A bloody fingerprint matching his was found on a cleaning bottle in the bathroom, suggesting he may have attempted to clean up after the murder. Bloody shoe prints matching his size and pattern were tracked throughout the apartment. DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Pashun. Perhaps most telling was what investigators found in Thomas's car: Taylen's diaper bag and several of his toys, along with a knife that appeared to have been recently cleaned but still contained traces of blood in the handle crevices. "The evidence against the suspect is overwhelming," stated the prosecutor. "We have physical evidence placing him at the scene, evidence of his attempt to clean up, the suspicious injuries to his hands, and his presence near the lake where the child was found." On March 31st, just 2 days after his birthday celebration, Thomas Mosley was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Pashun Jeffery and one for Taylen Mosley. He was held without bail, his injuries still bandaged as he appeared for his first court hearing. The community, already shocked by the brutality of Pashun's murder, was further devastated by the discovery of Taylen's fate. Vigils were held outside the apartment complex. The lake shore became a memorial site covered with stuffed animals, candles, and photos of the smiling toddler. "This case has affected our officers deeply," admitted Police Chief Holloway. "Many of us are parents. To imagine a father doing this to his own child, it's beyond comprehension." As the investigation continued, another disturbing aspect of the case emerged, one that would highlight a troubling gap in Florida's legal system and lead to calls for reform. The arrest of Thomas Mosley brought a wave of relief to the community, but it also marked the beginning of a complex legal process that would expose troubling gaps in Florida's legal system. As investigators continued building their case against Mosley, they uncovered additional evidence that painted an even more disturbing picture of the crime. Cell phone records revealed that Thomas's phone had pinged towers near Lake Maggiore around 5:30 a.m. on March 30th, confirming the witness account of seeing someone matching his description near the water. His internet search history showed queries about alligator habits and "do alligators eat humans" in the weeks leading up to the murders, suggesting a level of premeditation that shocked even veteran investigators. "This wasn't just a crime of passion," explained Detective Ramirez during a press conference. "The evidence suggests planning, particularly regarding what happened to Taylen. That makes this case even more horrifying." The prosecution built a timeline that showed Thomas had likely killed Pashun sometime after midnight, following the birthday party. He then took Taylen from the apartment, drove to Lake Maggiore in the early morning hours, and left his son in the water before seeking medical attention for his own injuries. While Thomas was being held without bail awaiting trial, another battle was brewing, one that would highlight a painful gap in Florida law. Under existing statutes, as Taylen's father and next of kin, Thomas Mosley technically had legal rights regarding his son's remains, despite being charged with his murder. This meant that Pashun's family, including Taylen's grandmother who had discovered the murder scene, had no legal authority to claim the toddler's body for burial without Thomas's permission. The situation created what many called a double victimization of the family. "It's unconscionable," said their family attorney. "This family has already endured the worst imaginable tragedy, and now they can't even lay this child to rest because the alleged killer has legal rights over the body." The law never anticipated this kind of situation. The case caught the attention of Florida State Senator Darrell Rousseau, who was moved by the family's plight. "No family should have to beg for permission from their loved one's killer to bury them properly," Rousseau stated. "This is a gap in our legal system that needs to be addressed immediately." Rousseau began drafting what would become known as Curtis Law, named after another case where a similar legal issue had arisen. The proposed legislation would prevent individuals charged with murder from having control over their victims' remains, allowing other family members to make funeral arrangements. While the legal battle over Taylen's remains continued, the community rallied around Pashun's family. A GoFundMe campaign raised over $50,000 to cover funeral expenses and support the family. Local businesses donated services for the eventual funeral, and grief counselors volunteered their time to help family members process the trauma. The case also sparked important conversations about domestic violence in the community. Advocates pointed out that domestic violence often escalates over time, and that many victims don't recognize the danger until it's too late. What happened to Pashun and Taylen is an extreme example, but it highlights how domestic violence can escalate to lethal levels, explained Melissa Thompson, director of a local domestic violence shelter. Many people don't realize that the most dangerous time for a victim is when they're trying to leave the relationship. That's when violence often peaks. Thompson noted that there had been no official reports of domestic violence between Thomas and Pashun, but that's not unusual. Many victims never report abuse. They're afraid, they're isolated, or they don't recognize the danger they're in. That's why community awareness is so crucial. In the months following the murders, several domestic violence awareness events were held in St. Petersburg. Attendance surged as community members shaken by what happened to Pashun and Taylen sought to understand how to recognize warning signs and help those at risk. Meanwhile, the legal case against Thomas Mosley continued to build. Forensic analysis confirmed that blood found under his fingernails matched Pashun's DNA. The knife recovered from his car contained microscopic blood particles that matched both Pashun and Thomas, supporting the theory that his hand injuries occurred during the stabbing attack. Perhaps most damning was security footage recovered from a neighbor's doorbell camera. The grainy video showed Thomas leaving Pashun's apartment around 3:30 a.m., carrying what appeared to be a bundled blanket, presumably containing Taylen. His car was then captured on traffic cameras, heading in the direction of Lake Maggiore. As the prosecution prepared for trial, Thomas's defense team faced an uphill battle given the overwhelming evidence. They initially explored an insanity defense, requesting psychological evaluations to determine if Thomas was mentally competent to stand trial. The nature of this crime is so extreme that it raises questions about the defendant's mental state, explained criminal defense attorney Jonathan Miller, who was not involved in the case but commented on it for local news. However, the evidence of planning and attempts to cover up the crime will make an insanity defense very difficult to pursue successfully. The psychological evaluations ultimately determined that Thomas was competent to stand trial, though his defense team continued to investigate his mental health history for potential mitigating factors. 6 months after the murders, Senator Rousson's proposed legislation gained traction in the Florida legislature. Curtis's law moved through committee hearings with bipartisan support, with Pashun's mother testifying about her family's ordeal. "My daughter and grandson were taken from me in the most brutal way imaginable," she told lawmakers, her voice breaking with emotion. "Then I had to fight for the right to bury my own grandson because the law protected his killer's rights over our families. No one should ever have to experience that kind of pain on top of losing their loved ones." The bill passed the Florida Senate unanimously and moved to the House for consideration. Legal experts predicted it would become law within the year, creating a lasting legacy from the tragedy of Taylen and Pashun's deaths. As the anniversary of the murders approached, the community planned a memorial service at Lake Maggiore, now transformed from a crime scene to a place of remembrance. The spot where Taylen's body was recovered had become an unofficial memorial, with weathered stuffed animals, faded photos, and fresh flowers marking the location. For the investigators who worked the case, the emotional impact lingered long after the evidence was cataloged and the reports filed. Many spoke of how the case had affected them personally, particularly those with children of their own. Some cases stay with you forever. This is definitely one of them. I still think about that little boy and what he must have experienced in his final moments. It's the kind of thing that makes you hold your own kids a little tighter at night. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationships that can turn deadly and the warning signs we collectively miss. Violence, like what happened to Pashun and Taylen, rarely emerges without warning. Research shows that domestic homicide is typically preceded by escalating patterns of control, isolation, and abuse. The birthday party that Pashun hosted for Thomas, an act of kindness that preceded her murder, highlights the complex dynamics that keep victims connected to their abusers. This case also exposes how children become the ultimate victims in domestic violence situations. Taylen, at just 2 years old, paid the ultimate price in a crime he couldn't possibly understand. Child welfare experts note that abusers often target children as the ultimate form of control and punishment against their partners. As we reflect on this case, we're left with difficult questions. How can we better identify families at risk? What resources might have helped Pashun escape before violence escalated? How can communities break the silence surrounding domestic abuse? There are no easy answers, but asking these questions is the first step toward preventing similar tragedies. The memories of Pashun and Taylen deserve nothing less than our commitment to creating a world where such violence becomes increasingly rare. The murders of Pashun Jeffery and Taylen Mosley represent more than just a horrific crime that shocked Florida. They serve as a devastating case study in how domestic violence can escalate to unimaginable extremes when warning signs go unaddressed. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationships that can turn deadly and the systemic failures that allow these tragedies to occur. Violence like what happened to Pashun and Taylen rarely emerges without warning. Research consistently shows that domestic homicide is typically preceded by escalating patterns of control, isolation, and abuse. The birthday party that Pashun hosted for Thomas, an act of kindness that preceded her murder, highlights the complex dynamics that keep victims connected to their abusers. Domestic violence thrives in silence. Victims often hide their situation out of shame, fear, or hope that things will improve. Meanwhile, abusers are frequently skilled at presenting a normal face to the outside world. This creates a perfect storm where dangerous situations remain invisible until they explode into violence. This case also exposes how children become the ultimate victims in domestic violence situations. Taylen, at just 2 years old, paid the ultimate price in a crime he couldn't possibly understand. Child welfare experts note that abusers often target children as the ultimate form of control and punishment against their partners. When we talk about domestic violence, we must remember it's not just about the adults involved, says child advocate Michael Torres. Children in these homes suffer trauma even when they're not physically harmed, and in the most extreme cases, like Taylen's, they become targets themselves. We need to recognize that protecting vulnerable adults also means protecting vulnerable children. The legal reforms sparked by this case highlight how tragedy can lead to meaningful change. Curtis law, if passed, will protect grieving families from the additional trauma of having to seek permission from their loved one's killer for funeral arrangements. While this change comes too late for Pashun's family, it may spare others similar pain in the future. Perhaps the most important lesson from this tragedy is that prevention requires community involvement. Neighbors who heard arguments but didn't intervene, friends who may have noticed concerning behavior but stayed silent, systems that failed to identify a family at risk, all represent missed opportunities for intervention. This doesn't mean placing blame on anyone other than Thomas Mosley for his actions. Rather, it's about recognizing that protecting vulnerable individuals requires collective vigilance and action. We all have a role to play in preventing domestic violence. Learn to recognize warning signs like extreme jealousy, isolation from friends and family, controlling behavior, and rapid relationship progression. If you notice these signs in someone you know, reach out. Let them know you're there, without judgment. Sometimes just knowing they have support can help victims take steps toward safety. As viewers of this story, you have an opportunity to turn this tragedy into action. Consider supporting organizations that work with domestic violence victims in your community. These groups often operate on limited budgets while providing crucial services like emergency shelter, legal advocacy, and counseling. Educate yourself about the warning signs of abuse and how to safely intervene. Share this information with others, not as gossip, but as potentially life-saving knowledge. Support legislation that protects victims and holds abusers accountable. Most importantly, if you suspect someone is in danger, don't remain silent. A phone call to a hotline, a supportive conversation, or even an anonymous tip to authorities could save a life. The story of Pashun and Taylen is heartbreaking, but it doesn't have to be repeated. By understanding the dynamics of domestic violence and taking action when we see warning signs, we can work toward a world where fewer families experience such devastating loss. If you found this story impactful, please share it with others. The conversation about domestic violence needs to happen in the open, not behind closed doors. Together, we can honor the memories of Pashun and Taylen by creating communities where such tragedies become increasingly rare. The story of Pashun Jeffery and Taylen Mosley is one that defies comprehension in its brutality and senselessness. A young mother just beginning her life's journey was taken in an act of extreme violence. A toddler, barely 2 years old, met an end so horrific that it shook even veteran investigators to their core. 2 lives full of promise and possibility were extinguished in a single night of violence that rippled outward, affecting an entire community and eventually prompting legal reform. What makes this case particularly haunting is its preventability. Like many domestic homicides, there were likely warning signs, moments when intervention might have changed the outcome. The birthday party Pashun hosted for Thomas just hours before her murder stands as a painful reminder of how victims often maintain connections with their abusers, sometimes out of hope, sometimes out of fear, sometimes simply because they see no way out. In the aftermath of this tragedy, the St. Petersburg community demonstrated remarkable resilience and compassion. Strangers came together to search for Taylen, to support Pashun's grieving family, and to demand changes that might prevent similar tragedies. The proposed Curtis Law represents one tangible outcome, a legal reform that acknowledges the additional trauma families face when navigating funeral arrangements for loved ones killed by their own family members. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy of Pashun and Taylen's story is the conversations it has sparked about domestic violence. In community centers, schools, and homes throughout Florida, people are talking about warning signs, available resources, and the importance of breaking the silence that allows abuse to flourish. These conversations won't bring back Pashun and Taylen, but they may save others from similar fates. As we conclude this account of their story, we're left with difficult questions about the nature of violence, the failures of our systems, and our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable. There are no easy answers, but in asking these questions, we honor the memories of a young mother and her son whose lives were cut tragically short. The apartment where Pashun and Taylen once lived is now occupied by new tenants. Lake Maggiore continues to draw visitors who know nothing of the tragedy that occurred there. Life moves forward, as it must. But for those who knew Pashun and Taylen, and for those who have followed their story, something has fundamentally changed. A heightened awareness of the violence that can hide behind closed doors, and perhaps a stronger commitment to preventing it. If their story has moved you, consider it a call to action. Learn the warning signs of domestic violence. Support organizations working to protect victims. Speak up when you see concerning behavior. In doing so, you help ensure that Pashun and Taylen's story, though ending in tragedy, might yet save others from the same fate.